Previously on the Lost Railways of County Down. Our journey has followed the remarkable growth of a railway network that once stretched across much of County Down. We began with the creation of the Belfast and County Down Railway in the 1840s. We followed the first trains to Comber. We watched the railway push deeper into the countryside towards Downpatrick. And most recently, we followed the rails through Dundrum to Newcastle, where the arrival of the railway helped transform a coastal town into one of County Down's great seaside destinations. But while trains were pushing south across County Down, another railway story had already begun along the shores of Belfast Lough, a railway heading towards Bangor. And surprisingly, it wasn't originally part of the Belfast and County Down Railway at all. If you've missed any of our previous episodes, you can watch the full series on our channel. New episodes are released every Wednesday and Saturday as we continue uncovering the lost railways of County Down. Now, let's continue our journey. The story of the railway to Bangor actually begins before the Belfast and County Down Railway had even opened its first line to Comber. During the 1840s, railway construction was spreading rapidly across Ireland. Belfast was growing. Industry was expanding. The population was increasing, and railway promoters were looking at the towns surrounding Belfast and asking a simple question: where should the rails go next? One obvious destination was Holywood. Situated on the southern shore of Belfast Lough, Holywood was close enough to Belfast to make regular passenger travel practical. In 1845, the Belfast, Holywood and County Down Railway Company was incorporated. Its first railway would connect Belfast with Holywood. Construction followed, and on the 2nd of August, 1848, the railway between Belfast and Holywood opened to passengers. This was an important moment. It was actually 2 years before the Belfast and County Down Railway opened its own Belfast to Comber route. But Holywood was never going to be the end of the story. Further along the coastline stood Bangor. Bangor was already developing as a seaside town. Its position overlooking Belfast Lough made it attractive to visitors, particularly as Belfast became larger, busier, and increasingly industrialized. For someone living among the factories, shipyards, and crowded streets of Victorian Belfast, the coast offered something completely different: fresh air, open water, beaches, and an escape from the city. But traveling there by road still took time. The railway could change that. Interestingly, the Belfast and County Down Railway itself once possessed powers to build towards Bangor using a completely different route. The proposed railway would have branched from the company's Donaghadee route around Conlig and continued towards Bangor. Had that railway been constructed, the railway map of County Down could have looked very different, but it never happened. Those powers eventually lapsed. Instead, Bangor would be reached from the west, along the coastline from Holywood. A new company emerged to make that happen: the Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor Railway. Its objective was straightforward: extend the existing railway beyond Holywood and continue along the southern shore of Belfast Lough towards Bangor. Building the route required engineers to squeeze the railway between the coastline and surrounding estates, but it also produced something special: a railway journey with views directly across Belfast Lough. Passengers traveling east could watch the coastline past their carriage windows, while ships moved through the waters nearby. The railway continued through Cultra, then towards Helen's Bay, and onwards towards Bangor. Stations along the route would eventually serve communities that became closely connected with Belfast. For residents living along this part of the County Down coast, the railway offered convenient access to the city. For visitors traveling in the opposite direction, it offered convenient access to the seaside. Then came the day Bangor had been waiting for. On the 1st of May 1865, the extension from Holywood to Bangor opened. For the first time, Bangor had a railway connection with Belfast. Imagine what that must have meant during the 1860s. A steam locomotive approaches the station. Smoke rises above the rooftops. Carriage doors open. Passengers step onto the platform. Some are visiting relatives. Some are traveling on business. Others have come simply to spend a day beside the sea, and they can now make the journey without relying entirely on horse-drawn road transport. The railway had changed the geography of everyday life. Bangor suddenly felt much closer to Belfast, and that would have enormous consequences for the town. As railway travel became established, Bangor continued to grow. More visitors could arrive. Businesses benefited from increased passenger traffic. Hotels and guest houses could accommodate people coming from Belfast and further afield. Shops served both residents and visitors. And the railway helped Bangor strengthen its position as a seaside resort. But there was another important difference between Bangor and destinations such as Newcastle. Bangor was close enough to Belfast for regular travel between the two places to become practical. The railway wasn't simply carrying holidaymakers. It was increasingly carrying people making regular journeys between Bangor and Belfast. People could live outside Belfast while maintaining a connection with the city. Morning trains could carry passengers towards Belfast. Later trains could bring them home. Today, traveling between Bangor and Belfast is completely ordinary. But during the 19th century, the railway represented a major change in how people could live, work, and travel. Railways were reshaping communities. However, operating a railway was expensive. Behind every passenger journey was an enormous amount of work. Locomotives required coal and water. Track needed constant inspection. Bridges needed maintenance. Stations needed staff. Signals needed operators. Carriages required repairs. And locomotives themselves needed workshops, engineers, and regular servicing. The Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor Railway faced financial difficulties. And eventually, another company became increasingly involved, the Belfast and County Down Railway. In 1874, the Belfast and County Down Railway leased the Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor Railway. The Bangor route was now being operated as part of the wider County Down system. For passengers, the change may not have seemed revolutionary. The trains continued to run. The stations remained. People still traveled between Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor. But behind the scenes, something important had happened. The BCDR had gained control of one of the most valuable passenger routes in the region, a railway serving growing residential communities, a railway serving a popular seaside resort, and a railway connecting Belfast directly with the coast. 10 years later, the relationship became permanent. In 1884, the Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor Railway was formally absorbed into the Belfast and County Down Railway. The separate company disappeared. Its railway, locomotives, carriages, and other assets became part of the BCDR system. Bangor was now officially part of the growing Belfast and County Down Railway network, and the line would become one of its greatest successes. Did you know? The railway to Bangor could have looked completely different. The Belfast and County Down Railway originally had powers for a route towards Bangor branching from its railway near Conlig. If that line had been constructed, trains approaching Bangor could have arrived from the south rather than following the coast from Holywood, but the proposed route was never built. Instead, the railway that survives today follows the route developed by the Belfast, Holywood, and Bangor Railway. So when you're traveling between Belfast and Bangor today, you're traveling along a railway whose history began with a separate Victorian railway company. And unlike so many of the railways we've explored throughout this series, this one survived. As the 19th century progressed, traffic on the Bangor route continued to grow. More trains were needed, more passengers were traveling, and parts of the railway were eventually doubled to provide greater capacity. What had begun as a relatively small coastal railway was becoming one of the busiest parts of the BCDR system. But the company wasn't satisfied with simply running trains beside Belfast Lough. At one point, it took its passengers onto the water itself. The Belfast and County Down Railway became associated with steamer services on Belfast Lough, including the famous Bangor boat. For Victorian and Edwardian travelers, the distinction between railway and steamship travel wasn't always as separate as we might imagine today. Railway companies were selling journeys. They wanted passengers. And anything that encouraged people to travel could benefit the railway. Imagine Belfast Lough during this period. Steam locomotives run along the southern shoreline, smoke trails behind them. Steamers cross the water. Sailing vessels and commercial shipping move towards Belfast. Passengers arrive at coastal stations. Holidaymakers travel towards Bangor. Workers travel towards the city. The entire area is becoming increasingly connected, and the railway is at the center of it. The Bangor line also demonstrated how dramatically the role of the railway had changed since the earliest days of the BCDR. When the first lines were constructed, agricultural produce, livestock, coal, and general goods were enormously important. Those things remained important, but passenger traffic was becoming increasingly valuable. Railways could influence where people went on holiday. They could influence where people lived. They could influence where businesses developed. And they could transform previously distant communities into places that suddenly felt connected. By the end of the 19th century, the Belfast and County Down Railway had become far more than the small railway that had first pushed towards Comber. Its trains served Belfast, Comber, Newtownards, Donadee, Downpatrick, Newcastle, Bangor, and numerous smaller communities in between. The company had inherited railways. It had operated lines built by other companies, it had expanded its own infrastructure, and its network had grown to more than 80 miles. But operating a railway of that size required something enormous behind the scenes. Most passengers never saw it. They saw the station, they bought their ticket, they boarded their carriage, they heard the guard's whistle, and the train departed. But somewhere, that locomotive had been prepared. Its fire had been lit, its boiler had been filled, its machinery had been inspected, its carriages had been cleaned. The track ahead had been maintained, signals had been checked, timetables had been organized, and hundreds of railway employees were working together to keep the system moving. At the center of much of this activity was Belfast. The BCDR's Queens Quay facilities became the beating heart of the railway. Locomotives came and went. Carriages were repaired. Engineering work was carried out. Goods were handled. Passengers poured through the station. And as the railway grew, the facilities needed to grow with it. This is where our story begins to change. Because we've spent the first part of this series following the railway across the map, we've watched the lines reach new towns. We've watched stations open. We've watched communities become connected. But now we're going to look behind the trains themselves. Because by the late 19th century, the Belfast and County Down Railway was approaching the height of its power. Thousands of passengers depended upon it. Goods moved across its network. Locomotives traveled through County Down every day, and an enormous workforce was required to keep everything running. In the next episode of The Lost Railways of County Down, we'll enter the golden age of the BCDR. We'll discover what happened behind the scenes at one of Ireland's most fascinating railway companies. The workshops, the locomotives, the carriages, the railway workers, the stations, and the huge operation required to keep more than 80 miles of railway alive. But before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever traveled on the Belfast to Bangor Railway? Maybe you use it today. Maybe you remember traveling the route decades ago. Perhaps someone in your family worked on the railway. Or maybe you've noticed old railway features along the route that most passengers simply pass without ever seeing. Leave us a comment below and tell us your story. We've really enjoyed reading your comments throughout this series, and some of the memories being shared are helping keep the history of these railways alive. If you've enjoyed episode 6, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this series reach more people who share our interest in County Down's railway history. And remember, a new episode of The Lost Railways of County Down is released every Wednesday and Saturday until our journey is complete. Thanks for watching, and join us next time as we step inside the golden age of the Belfast and County Down Railway.